final session, I just want to acknowledge John Eisen and Catherine for bringing this session together, because there's a number of reasons. I mean, it's amazing the way things work, isn't it, as we're going to talk about. But when I came over to New Zealand last year, I was running a bit behind schedule because the accommodation that had been arranged for me was way up in north of Auckland. And the lady who was arranging the conversation said, "Oh, by the way, there's a magazine editor that wants to meet you." And, well, if you knew how many times I've heard that sort of observation, and I never got too excited about meeting magazine editors. And we were running way behind schedule, and I said to her, I said, "You know what, if we have time to sit with this guy, great. If not, well, you know, so be it." Anyway, we got here, it was in this venue, and we had a little bit of time. So I hooked up with John. He could hardly speak at the time because he was suffering from laryngitis. But we sat down in the cafe just around the corner, and, you know, we got on okay. And then at the end of the evening, he said, "Oh, by the way," he said, "take a few of my magazines. Have a look at my magazines and see what you think." And, of course, in the journey back to the UK, there's a fair amount of time to kill. So I started flicking through these magazines, and I realized this was actually the best product I'd seen. You know, we had Nexus in the UK, but we had nothing of this caliber. So I called John, I think it was about 2 weeks after I got back to the UK, and asked him if, you know, we could actually discuss how we might bring them to Europe. And so that was how I became the publisher of Uncensored magazine in Europe. And then 6 weeks later, I decided that if we got Uncensored, we might as well go the whole hog and go with Natural Medicine as well. So we've just been going for 1 year. Thank you. But anyway, John said, "Look, if you come back to New Zealand," and he said, "and Uncensored magazine will pay your airfares." So I'm actually here because of the generosity of John Eisen and Uncensored magazine. So thank you. And I know most of you are here because of one or other of the magazines, but they are great magazines. I think they're going to go from strength to strength, and I think in the coming months or years, then I think that Uncensored is really going to take off, because, you know, the mainstream media's circulation is falling, because more and more people are realizing that what is published by the mainstream media is just bullshit, basically. It's just propaganda. You know, and the alternative publications, and particularly Uncensored, you know, Duncan Rhodes does a very good job with Nexus, but he likes to have his PhDs. You know, Duncan likes to have most of his articles in Nexus written by PhDs, because he's almost looking for some kind of sort of pseudo-acceptance of the material that he publishes. And it's great. I mean, Nexus, without any shadow of doubt, has its place, and it's very complementary. But what I think Uncensored does is it fills the gap, because it covers the spectrum, and I think it's very, very readable. So, thanks, John. Right, and of course, Natural Medicine. You know, in the UK, it would actually be illegal for me now to publish that magazine as the Journal of Natural Medicine, because natural medicines, as of May the 1st next year, are illegal. But because it's the New Zealand Journal of Natural Medicine, I can simply say, yeah, but, you know, it's what's going on in New Zealand. I'm only publishing it so that people can see what's going on in New Zealand. So we'll see how long we can get away with that one anyway. Okay, so we're heading into this arena now, and of course, you know, over the break, I've had a number of people share with me their remarkable experiences. And of course, they are remarkable because the left brain can't explain them. If the left brain could explain them, you know, we wouldn't consider them to be remarkable. But the left brain can't deny them either. Although, as I'm going to share with you, there are people who will do everything they possibly can to deny that experience. That's called cognitive dissonance. You know, the deliberate attempt by the left brain to effectively shut down an observation which actually can't be denied, but to shut it down because to acknowledge it would force them to change their worldview. So they'd rather deny it. So I said that I would share with you some of the experiences from people who have had a world or life-changing experience which came upon them unexpectedly. and in the cases I'm going to share with you, potentially tragic circumstances, but tragedy that turned into something completely different. The first person I want to introduce you to is this lady here. This lady holding her brain, well, it's not her brain, but holding a brain, is a lady called Jill Bolte Taylor. Jill Bolte Taylor is a neuroanatomist. In the mid-1990s, when she was in her mid-30s, she was very, very highly regarded in the study of neuroanatomy. In fact, she was so well regarded that she held positions in academia that were normally reserved for people 20 years her senior. And her specific area of study was recovery from strokes. She was studying the causes of strokes, the effects of strokes, and the recovery of from strokes. Well, in late 96, early 97, she woke up one morning and realized that she didn't feel too good. And she didn't really understand why, because she hadn't had a heavy night the night before. But she realized that things were a little bit fuzzy and she wasn't thinking quite straight. Well, as the morning wore on, she realized that actually she was in a bit of trouble. And then she collapsed. She was found by her mother, and she was rushed to hospital, where it was established that she'd had a stroke. Focus on you again? Well, maybe. When you can Google her giving one of a TED TV 15-minute talk, and it's really quite interesting because it's a classic example of the rose-coloured glasses kicking in as well. Because she's very bubbly, and when she's telling the story, she says, so there I was, this young, very well-regarded neuroanatomist studying strokes. And when I woke up and realised I wasn't feeling very good, it suddenly hit me. I was having a stroke. And I thought, oh, this is exciting. That's the rose-coloured glasses. Well, that's how she sees it, sometime after the event, of course. But the stroke shut down her left brain. And when she effectively came round, when she came back into consciousness, it wasn't a normal consciousness. In fact, her immediate concern was that she was actually in a dreamlike world and she couldn't even perceive where she started and finished. Where her physical vehicle started and finished, because she was just part of everything. And as she was sort of in awe of this new realm, there would be flashes that she would get of people coming in and out of her life, like doctors, like nurses, like her mother. And her mother became her primary carer. And it's actually thanks to her mother, I think, that she made such an amazing recovery in such a relatively short time. But while she was having this experience, she was sufficiently compos mentis to employ the curiosity to be able to try and learn as much about it as she could. She realized she was in a new arena. Now, at the time, initially, she didn't realize whether she was dead or alive, dreaming, in a coma. She had no idea. It was a completely new reality. Some of the things that she started to experience, though, is that she could tell when people were coming to see her. Sometimes she would know a few minutes before they walked through the door, or she would know the day before, or a few days before. But not only that, she could tell whether people were coming to see her out of genuine concern, or just because they were curious. She also discovered that she could predict what was about to happen. And one example, one story that she tells, is that, and this is actually quite synchronistic from a discussion we were having earlier in the day, that she could tell when her mother was going to bring her something, because she would think, oh, I could do with an apple. And then her mother would bring in an apple. And one of the things that she was never actually able to ultimately determine, although she asked herself the question, was she simply being prescient that her mother was about to bring in an apple, or was she creating the event? And she had to leave that one hanging out there. But as these experiences unfolded, she had these flashes of recollection back to her colleagues in neuroanatomy, and she realized that actually this experience would be incredibly useful if she could share it with her colleagues in research. The only problem was she had completely lost control of all her motor skills. So she literally had to fight to re-educate herself so that she redeveloped basically speech, writing, recognition. And with her mother's help, she eventually got there. And she wrote this book, and this is an absolutely stunning book. It's called My Stroke of Insight. Now, this book is an easy read because it's written by somebody who's not trying to explain what happened. She wasn't writing it as a scientist writing an academic paper trying to justify all of the hypotheses. She was simply recounting her experience of life through the right brain. Bless you. One of the other things, of course, that she learned is that she never slept. She did sleep, of course. In other words, the physical vehicle laid down and rested, but the right brain never slept. She was always conscious. And that's, of course, why we dream. You know, the left brain gets out of the way and we're able to go off into the other realms. But because she was in this permanent state, the left brain was completely out of the way, so she never slept. Now, what is truly remarkable here is the guy who I was talking about earlier, Tony Wright, who wrote the book Left in the Dark, he also, in the mid-90s, in fact 2 years before Jill Bolte-Taylor had her stroke, Tony Wright participated in an experiment with Manchester University in the UK where under medical supervision he was sleep deprived for 5 days. And the purpose of the sleep deprivation was to shut down the left brain. Now, obviously sleep deprivation can have very serious health effects. That's why Tony was under very strict medical supervision and why he was restricted to 5 days. And Tony, with the benefit of hindsight, actually acknowledges that was probably pretty good because otherwise he'd have stayed there. But the irony is, the remarkable thing is, that his experiences of life through the right brain, through shutting down the left brain by sleep deprivation, was almost identical to Jill Bolte-Taylor's experience us having the stroke.
Yeah. You know what the best part about being on methamphetamine is? It's only 3 more sleeps till Christmas.
Yeah, that's not to be encouraged. Another way in which you can do this is through breath work. Now this is very hard for about 20 minutes. I think it's a lot easier than sleep deprivation. But if you can find a good breath work practitioner, and one of the best in the business is a lady called Dika Beg. And I had the pleasure of a couple of sessions with Dika Beg, 3 sessions I think with Dika. And after that I decided, I'd been everywhere I needed to go. But it's hard work. It's absolutely, and the last time I did it, I was on the point of giving up because I just couldn't get there. I couldn't get beyond that sort of final hurdle of shutting down the left brain completely. Anyway, just as I was about to give up, bang, over I went. Anyway, when I came back into the body, and Dika is with you the whole way, and she's monitoring the whole process. And when eventually I came back into the body, and she brought me back gently, and she said, so, good ride? I said, oh my God, unbelievable. And she said, I just wanted you to know, you've been away for 12 minutes, and your heart rate slowed to 6 beats a minute.
Wow.
And your breathing basically stopped. Yeah. Now, this is not to be tried at home. It's like rebirthing. I wouldn't really call it rebirth, but it's very similar. It's not the sort of Leonard Orr type rebirthing type process. It's actually a process that I got a feeling that Dika worked or has worked with Leonard Orr, but it's her own technique. Anyway, a remarkable lady. But sorry. Well, she gets you breathing at a certain rate, and it's hard ways. So she gets you sort of hyperventilating. But I mean, she's guiding you the whole time. It's like, you're following her instructions, And then, you know, you go in there, you're thinking, oh God, this is outrageous, it's such hard work. And I'm going to stop. No, I've had enough. And then bang, you're gone. Oh yeah? Okay, very good. So you know what I'm talking about. By the way, talk about synchronicities. When I finished the first session, John came up and said, you know that book, Mind Reach? He said, I've got a first edition copy. What do you know? Anyway, so you know, there are various techniques that one can experience temporarily, because I wouldn't envisage or I wouldn't encourage anyone to go the stroke route. But there are techniques where people can sort of experience the right brain view of the world, if you like, on a temporary basis. But like I said, it's not something to be messed with. And if you're going to do it with an appropriate practitioner. The next person I want to introduce you to is a lady called Claire Sylvia. No, it's not. Yes, it is, because that's Claire Sylvia. Claire Sylvia. In 1987, this lady had an atrocious quality of life. She was in desperate need of a heart transplant. Otherwise, she was going to die. She was on life support, a liquid diet, and she'd been this way for quite some time. Anyway, eventually, a hospital called her and said, we think we found a donor. And so she was told to get her affairs in order, which, of course, when you're going to have a heart transplant means saying your goodbyes because you might not be coming home. And she went off to the hospital. When they opened her up, they realized that a heart transplant wasn't going to cut it, because actually the heart and the lungs were so deteriorated. So the hospital called the other hospital where the donor was being prepared and asked the hospital if it was going to be possible to take the heart and the lungs out as a single unit. So this is 1987, so she was one of the earliest heart-lung transplant patients. Well, like I said, she'd had a really atrocious quality of life for quite a number of years up to this point. She certainly, you know, didn't eat junk food and certainly didn't drink alcohol. And yet, when she woke up from the anaesthetic, the first thing she said was, oh, I could murder a beer and a Kentucky Fried Chicken. And then it was like, where did that come from? Well, over the next few days and weeks, she realized that she was no longer just Claire Sylvia. She had incorporated some elements of the personality, even the consciousness of the donor. And she felt this incredible, compelling need to make contact with the donor's family. Now, this is complete anathema in medicine. You know, the donors' families and the recipients and the families are kept absolutely apart. And perhaps, you know, what occurred here is an indication of why that is still the case. Because with the help of a friend, she was able to track down the donor. I mean, she knew the date, she knew the approximate location. It wasn't hard to really work out. And she established that the donor was a young 18-year-old male who was killed in a motorbike accident. Obviously massive head trauma, and actually a number of the organs had been used for transplants. Well, some members of the family were delighted to meet with her, because at least it gave them an opportunity to see that, you know, their loved one had contributed to the continuing life of somebody else. But other members of the family just couldn't bear to be anywhere near her, which then caused a split in the donor's family. So you can see why this is a difficult situation. But as time wore on, she realized that, you know, there was no way that she was ever going to be just Claire Sylvia again. She was Claire Sylvia plus the elements of this young male 18-year-old donor. So much so that there were occasions, I mean, this woman was completely heterosexual, and yet she would find that every time a beautiful young woman walked past, she would instinctively... And this is the book she wrote, by the way, A Change of Heart. The extraordinary story of a man's heart in a woman's body. And when it appeared in the media, this was the media headline, I was given a young man's heart and started craving beer and Kentucky Fried Chicken. My daughter said I even walked like a man, especially when a good-looking woman was walking the other way. Now, of course, what this brings into our consciousness is the possibility that there is more to consciousness than orthodoxy would have us believe, i.e. that everything revolves around the brain. Now, when I was discussing this with my good friend, the retired orthopedic trauma surgeon, He said, Ian, he said, it's not just organs. He said, of which there are now many, many cases of people taking on some characteristics of the donor. And he said there's some amazing characteristics. He said that, the one he told me about was a guy who hated classical music, and he received the kidney of a young woman who was a very accomplished classical musician. And whilst the recipient didn't become a classical musician, he developed a love for classical music and actually became a journalist on classical music. So he said that there's so many stories like this now that it's undeniable that there are elements of the personality, the psyche, the consciousness, whatever, that go with the organ. Now, there's a downside to this, and this next story has a sort of tragic ending. And I've got to tell you that when I discovered this particular story, God forbid, but if I ever need a transplant, I want to know the origins of the donor. Or I want somebody to check the origins of the donor first. This is a very tragic situation. I'm going to read the story. Newspaper article published in 2006. Mr. Graham, the recipient, said he felt an instant and unusual attachment when he met his donor's widow. He said, I felt like I had known her for years. He said, I couldn't keep my eyes off her, I just stared. Well, it wasn't only his eyes he couldn't keep off her, because he married her. So this is the recipient marrying the donor's widow. But now, 12 years after the operation, Mrs. Graham's life, i.e. the widow of the donor, but her life has been rocked by another tragedy, because Mr. Graham, the recipient, killed himself with a shotgun in circumstances, and this should be identical, in circumstances identical to those which claimed Mr. Cottle, the donor's life. His friends said he had shown no signs of being depressed and were at a loss to explain his sudden death. It says, according to scientists, there are more than 70 documented cases of transplant patients taking on some of the personality traits of the organ donors. Now, of course, today it's literally hundreds. But what happened here is that the donor had committed suicide by putting the shotgun in his mouth, and of course, massive head trauma. Bit different from the motorcyclist, of course, who also died from massive head trauma. But the circumstances leading up to the death were very, very different. And although it was 12 years later, but what is interesting is that the widow, Mrs. Cottle, claims that she never ever discussed the way by which her previous husband had died. Now, again, we've got to take that maybe with a little bit of pinch, but that's what she claims. And even if she did, it's still remarkable, of course, that the guy should commit suicide in exactly the same way when there were no signs of depression. So I've got to say that, from a medical standpoint, there should certainly be some kind of control as to whether somebody is a suitable donor.
Was there any synchronicities with the amount of time they've been married?
No, I don't know. Good point, though. But when I was discussing Catherine, go on. Yeah, obviously this is an area that really deserves a lot more study, because we're 46 years into the history of heart transplants, but still the amount of research that is in the public domain is very limited. Now, what was interesting, when I was discussing these issues with my good friend, the retired trauma surgeon, he said, Ian, he said, this even extends to blood transfusions. And he said, and that is why when we have somebody who needs massive amount of blood, we have to keep them sedated for quite lengthy periods. He said, of course, we tell the relatives that it's to help them recover, which is not untrue, but actually the primary reason for the sedation is to allow the blood to settle down. He said, yeah, we really don't know actually what caused it, we just know it because we can't deny the experiences. And he said that actually the hypothesis amongst himself and his colleagues is that it actually depends on how active the spleen is in terms of bringing the new blood back to an equilibrium. And he said eventually, if the spleen is healthy, it will achieve an equilibrium, and there's no evidence of any long-lasting effects. But he said if we didn't sedate the individual, they would almost be in a state of psychosis. So there is way more to the whole issue of consciousness than, of course, we are led to believe by orthodoxy. So, we need to acknowledge that the received wisdom that tends to build up our worldview is extremely limited. And then actually we've got to open our minds to all sorts of possibilities. And the last case I'm going to share with you on this is a very, very recent case. Now, I was really annoyed that I actually hadn't been able to buy this book when I left the UK, because its publication date in the UK was October the 23rd, which happens to be my son's birthday as well. My eldest son, that is. And I was looking out for this book, and I left the UK, hadn't seen any sign of it. When I landed in Perth, it was all over the book stands. So I bought a copy of the book. And that book is written by this guy, Ibn Alexander. Ibn Alexander. Now, it's received a massive amount of publicity in the US and in Europe. This is a guy who was and is a neurosurgeon. Absolutely the epitome of the reductionist Newtonian view of neuroscience. And he says that, in his career, he often came across people, patients, who he performed surgery on, who would talk about their experiences whilst they were under anaesthetic or in a coma. And he said that, his attitude was always, very interesting, right? Yeah, oh, amazing, yeah, really good. Fantastic, incredible. Amazing, see you next week. He said he never really paid too much attention. Until in 2008, he had a similar sort of wake-up experience to Jill Bolte-Taylor, where he got up from bed in the morning and realised he didn't feel too good. In fact, he had terrible back pain. And then it crept up his spine and went to his head. And do you know what his reaction was when his wife said, I think we need to call 911? His reaction was, no, don't call 911, anything but 911. It's amazing the number of doctors who the last thing they want if they think they're in trauma is to be taken to hospital. Anyway, it was obvious that he was in a real bad way, so she called 911. Along came the ambulance, they took it to the hospital where he worked. So he was immediately under the medical jurisdiction of his colleagues at the hospital. Anyway, the guy was descending, he was disappearing fast. He was going into a deep coma. And they went through all the usual tests to find out what was causing this. And eventually they were able to ascertain that this was a unique strand of E. coli. In fact, it was a strain of E. coli that they'd never seen before, and they still haven't managed to identify specifically what this brand was. I mean, they even investigated whether it was a weaponized version that he picked up in a recent visit in Israel. Because there had been a case of a weaponized E. coli outbreak when he was in Israel. But they dismissed that, and they, as far as I'm aware, to this day, they still haven't been able to identify what this particular strain of E. coli was. Anyway, it was nailing him. He was basically dead. He'd been there for 7 years. He'd been in the coma for 7 days. And his colleagues called the family together and said, look, we've done everything we possibly can. He is basically dead. There are no vital signs whatsoever. And we know from conversations that we've had with Eben that he would not want to be living life as a vegetable on a life support machine. So we think the appropriate thing to do is to say your goodbyes, and we'll turn off the life support. So the family went into the room in the intensive care unit, and they went in there to say their goodbyes. And as they were standing around the bed, he opened his eyes and said, "Hello? What are you all doing here?" Well, That was about the only thing that made any sense that came out of his mouth initially, because it was very clear that he was fried. I mean, the brain was fried. I mean, he was making comments as though he was still a student. He would then be talking as though one of his sports was parachute jumping, and he would suddenly go into a sort of routine where he was about to take a parachute jump. So clearly the whole of the mind had been sort of messed up. But anyway, he was awake, much to the surprise of the doctors. What was even more of a surprise was he started then to talk about where he'd been whilst he'd been in the comatose state. And of course, they're all going, yeah, well, of course, yeah. Oh, very interesting, yeah. Yeah, okay, all right, you can see you next week. He went, you don't want to listen? And of course, he realised that he was getting the same reaction that he'd always given to his own patients when they'd made similar observations. But he was excited because he'd been in places that were just amazing. And he wanted to share these experiences with his colleagues because he was now totally of the opinion that consciousness doesn't reside within the physical vehicle. When he made sufficient recovery to go home, he told his son, his eldest son, that he was going to write a book about his experiences. But before he wrote the book, he wanted to research other people's near-death experience. And his son said, Dad, don't do that. Don't research anybody else's experience. He said, because the danger is, if you do, and then you write your account, there's the danger that you will incorporate somebody else's experiences rather than it being, your own account. So he did that. He actually sat down and wrote the account of his time whilst he was in the coma. And only when he finished the transcript did he then start to actually research other people's near-death experience. The book is called Proof of Heaven. I nailed it in 3 days. It's an absolute page-turner. It's absolutely an outstanding. Now, Proof of Heaven might be a bit extreme, but it gets your attention. Here is a guy who 4 years ago was absolutely locked into reductionist Newtonian neuroscience. He has had an experience that has rocked his worldview. Of course, being a neuroscientist, he was able to study his own medical records. And as he was working through the medical records, he said, yep, I was dead. Yep. And he absolutely concurred that his colleagues had made absolutely the right call when they told the family that they were going to switch off the life support machines. And of course, what he's also doing now is he's trying to revisit the whole of the guidelines as to what constitutes death. Yeah? He has even put forward the hypothesis that actually there is no hard drive within any of us. That the hard drive is out there in the ether or somewhere, and that we are simply a RAM, the random access memory, that taps in to whatever that's out there. Another example of that possibility, how many of you have heard of Nancy Stufer? Nancy Stufer? No? I'm amazed. No, I'm not. Nancy Stufer was a Californian author of children's books. In 1984, that year again, Nancy Stufer published the first in a short series of books about a boy wizard. The boy wizard in Nancy Stufer's books was called Larry Potter. Larry Potter was born of wizards who were killed. And he was raised by relatives who were non-wizards, and the non-wizards were called muggles. The series of books, I think, only extended to about 3. They were never published outside of California and only in very short print runs. About 9 years ago, no, a little more now, 11 years ago, Nancy Stufer took J.K. Rowling to court in New York. New York was chosen because it's halfway between California and London. it is my opinion that the judge made absolutely the correct call when he stated that J.K. Rowling was not guilty of plagiarism. Because there was no evidence to suggest that J.K. Rowling had ever come into contact with any of Nancy Stufer's work. I mean, when J.K. Rowling wrote the first Harry Potter book, that was like 1990, she wrote it in 95. It was really before the days of the internet, and there was no way that Nancy Stufer's books were on the internet. Now, apparently there was a sort of contribution made to a charity on behalf of Nancy Stufer, but I absolutely believe that there was no plagiarism. I mean, if there was plagiarism, don't you think that J.K. Rowling would have been smart enough to come up with a completely different name? Yeah. You know, and she wouldn't have used Harry Potter, or she wouldn't have used Muggles. It's just a bit too obvious. But also, I've learned as well that I don't have an original idea in my head, because every time I think of something that I think is original, I can go on the internet and within about 3.5 nanoseconds, of course, find there's a whole bunch of other people that have come up with the same idea. That's why you get books that are written on very similar subjects coming out at very similar times. It's why you get films that are made on certain themes coming out at very similar times. There's no collusions between the studios. We're just tapping into, whether it's the zeitgeist of the moment or the ether or whatever, we're tapping in. Which of course lends credence to Eben Alexander's hypothesis that, you know, we are not hardwired. We tap in to the mainframe, which is outside somewhere.
Apparently the telescope was invented by 9 guys on the same night on opposite ends of the Earth.
Well, and of course the telescope is also depicted in the Eka stones, which date way back. But yeah, we tap into something. So basically, I'm not suggesting for one moment that any of this is definitive. Of course it's not. But that's not what it's intended to be. What it's intended to do is to stimulate the idea that basically we know absolutely nada. We must become perennial students. You know, we must get away from the received wisdom, the worldview that's created by received wisdom, which is effectively the construct of those who think they're the rightful rulers of a planetary fiefdom. What we've also got an opportunity to do here is recognize that, you know, the left brain is the transmitter-receiver for this 5-sense reality. The right brain is the transmitter-receiver for everything else. And everything else operates outside of a time-space continuum. You know, one of the things that I've been doing with these workshops over the past 18 months or so is I've been collating the emails that I get from people telling me of the right brain experiences they've had. Because one of the things that occurs with these types of workshops now is some people have the right brain experience a day or two before they come to the workshop. And the workshop actually sort of puts it into some kind of perspective for them. Others have the experience a few days afterwards, and then they'll send me the email saying, oh, you won't believe what's happened. Well, of course I do.
An amazing collection of wonderful experiences you will find in the works of Lyle Watson. No, Lyle Watson?
Yeah, absolutely.
Romeo Era and a few other books.
Yeah.
Marine biologist and many other things.
Yeah.
And he went all over the world to look for such experiences.
So they're normal.
Very often he didn't.
Yeah.
He didn't have an explanation for it, but he said, here it is.
Yeah.
A shaman was sticking his head into the water, and he could tell what was going on in the neighboring island 300 kilometers away, and he had a film team there verifying it. He had no idea how it worked, but he said, here it is.
Yep. There is, like all things, different people have different skills. Yeah? So just the same as we all have different abilities in terms of, you know, the physical empirical realm, we all have different abilities in the non-material. You know, some people are amazing natural healers. Some people are amazing remote viewers. You know, some people, you know, may be influencing the outcome of certain events. Whatever. It's a case of exploring. And then, as I said before, it's the practice. One of the most remarkable experiences that came from the workshops was, this was when I did a workshop in Portsmouth in the south of the UK. And 5 minutes before the workshop was due to start, this guy walked through the door, in his late 60s, and he walked through the door and he's like, oh, God. And I walked over and I said, are you okay? I said, you know, you need a glass of water or something? He said, no, I'm fine. Gosh, I just need to sit down. Anyway, he sat down and calmed down, and we started the event. And then in the afternoon, when we started to talk about the remarkable experiences, he said, I've got to share this with you. He said, because, you know, I came in a bit flustered this morning. And I said, yeah, I did notice. And he said, well, I was trying to come to terms with what had happened on my way here. He said, because I live in the Medway towns, and that's nearly 200 miles away. And he said, I knew it was going to take me at least 3 hours to drive here. It's motorway all the way, almost all the way. So he said, I could do it at least 3 hours. He said, no, the workshop started at 11. He said, I knew that I had to be up by no later than 7, out the door by 7:30, and then I would be here. I'd got a little bit of leeway, but I would definitely be here in time for the workshop to start at 11. He said, but for some reason, my alarm didn't go off. He said, I didn't get up until 9 o'clock. And he said, and I was just beating myself up. He said, I jumped in the shower. He said, I had a 5-minute shower. I grabbed a quick bite of breakfast. He said, I was out the door by 9:30. He said, but I got a 3-hour drive. He said, I knew I was going to probably miss the morning. And he said, I got to the end of the road, and he said, that's the last thing I remember. And the next thing I remembered, I was 5 miles away from the venue, and it was 11:15. And he said, and I pulled into the car park just before 11:05. And he said, and that was why I was, you know, a little bit flustered this morning. He said, I still don't know how I got here. And I said, well, you know, as it happens, what you experienced was a time slip. And, as you know, different people have experienced them to some degree. I said, I've got to say, that's a really amazing time slip. But a lady called Jenny Randalls actually wrote a book, I think about 20 years ago, called Time Storms. And again, sort of recounting the experiences of people that had massive losses or compressed time. Well, you know, one of the things that, you know, we find over time is that time isn't linear. You know, when I came back to the UK, which was on September the 16th, 2001, 5 days after 9/11, it's the first time I'd really lived in the UK for nearly 15 years. But that was when I started building up my library. And so my library today is quite extensive, and I promise you I've read every book in my library. But there hasn't been time. If I take into account every book, then I must have nailed one book every couple of days. But I haven't. But I've still managed to read all those books. I can't explain it. But the time isn't linear in that respect over time. Another way in which a lot of people experience is if you want to get somewhere at a particular time, and I'm not suggesting you try and do this where you've got a 3-hour journey and you want to do it in an hour and a half. But you know, you've got to be reasonable about it. But if you practice, what you'll find is that if you're reasonable in your estimate, you'll get there at exactly that time. But be very careful, because I messed it up the other way. I had an event, and the town of the event was about a 2-hour drive from where I live. And I had to pick up some other people on the way. And they said, what time do you want to pick us up, Ian? And I said, well, I want to be there at 5. So I said, I'll pick you up at 2. And they said, you sure? You know, you really want to pick us up that early? And I said, yeah. I said, I definitely want to be there by 5. Now, in theory, once I picked these guys up at 2, I should have been able to get to the venue in about an hour and a half. So I should have picked them up at 2. We should have arrived there at 3:30. But I was absolutely adamant that I wanted to be there by 5. And even though I know the route, somewhere along the line I got so lost and I couldn't find my way back onto the motorway. So you know what time I pulled up? 5 o'clock. Be careful where you play the game. So listen, every one of us... John, you can say.
Yeah, I was waiting for you to mention sheltering. Since you had it, I thought I would just reject that as lightly as possible.
Go on.
Sheltering was talking about mortgage residents. And you were looking for the word talking about the people with that. Sheltering,
Okay, thanks. The point is, there is a lot of literature out there, but it's like all things. You've actually got to have an interest in the subject, and you've got to want to go looking for it. And now, of course, when you go looking for it, it's going to jump out at you. Maybe literally. Maybe literally. By the way, at this point, I'll just maybe share with you Einstein's party trick. Do you want to know what Einstein's party trick was? Einstein, of course, said he never taught. He simply created the environment in which people could learn. But his party trick was that he would go to a university, give a lecture at a university, and of course at the end of the evening, or the end of the lecture, all the students would crowd around him wanting to ask him questions. And then as he was talking, he'd say, oh, let's go to the library. Now it would be a university that it would be a matter of record that he'd never lectured at before. One of the students would lead off and walk to the library. When they got to the library, Einstein would take the lead. And he would start walking around the library, just randomly, and then he'd run his finger along a shelf. And then, without even sort of pausing for breath, he wouldn't even look. He'd just grab the book, turn to a student and go, page 127, third paragraph down. I think confirms exactly what I'm talking about. And of course the student would open the book, page 127, third paragraph down. Oh, God damn. And then, show the other students the book. And then, of course, they turned to Einstein and he'd gone. He was away, leaving them to ponder what they just witnessed. Jung spent most of his life very concerned that his contemporaries might discover his invisible friend, who he named Philemon. Jung wrestled all through his life with trying to come to terms with whether Philemon was part of himself but not part of his waking consciousness, or was an external consciousness that he was tapping into. In later life, he actually acknowledged, towards the end of his life, he actually acknowledged that a lot of his insight had come from conversation with Philemon. And if you Google Jung and Philemon, you'll actually find quite a lot that's been written about it now. And again, in later life, Jung actually drew what he considered to be a visual image of Philemon, and what he drew was an angel. Now, that was his interpretation. And of course, we all come up with our own interpretation based on our core belief system. I mean, even Alexander in his book, what you read is a core Christianized version of his experiences. Had he been a Muslim, it might have been slightly different. Had he been Jewish, it might be slightly different again. And that's why it's so important not to get hung up on our dogma associated with a belief system that has originated from the construct, but to try and keep a totally open mind. Now, one of the reasons that this is, I think, so important to us right now is, as I said right at the very start, there's a lot of cultures that talk about this particular period in our evolutionary process being very, very significant. And probably the most significant of those cultures, I mean, everyone's aware of the Mayan calendar and the fact that we are now, less than 30 days away from the end of a 5,125-year Baktun. But there's another culture that talks about this period without a specific date, and that's the Quero of Peru. And in 2009, I had this overwhelming urge to go visit the Quero. Now, I'd read a lot of the works of a guy called Alberto Villoldo. Has anybody heard of Alberto Villoldo? Okay. I'd read a lot of his stuff, and my former partner had done a number of his Four Winds workshop programs, but they never really appealed to me. And I read Alberto's website and saw that he was running a trip to Peru in June of 2010. So I thought, well, I'm going to give a call and just see if I can go along. But on the website it said, priority is given to people who are following the Four Winds program, which I certainly wasn't, but it didn't say you couldn't go if you weren't following the Four Winds program. So I called Alberto's office. And this guy answered the phone, and I said, I'm just calling to see if I can join Alberto's tour to Peru next June. And the guy said, well, yeah, that's a possibility. Let me take a few details. First of all, he said, are you following the Four Winds program? And I said, well, no, I'm not, but I did see on the website that it did say priority would be given, but it didn't say that I couldn't go. He said, yeah, that's okay, that's fine. He said, okay, a few personal details. Can I take your name? And I said, yeah, my name's Ian Crane. And there was a silence at the other end of the phone, and he said, this guy said, would that be Ian R. Crane? And I said, yes. And he said, well, 48 hours ago, I had never heard of you. He said, but yesterday, somebody sent me a link to a presentation that you gave on Codex Alimentarius. And he said, and I've watched the whole presentation. And he said, so, synchronistically, he said, how can I refuse? So I said, so who am I talking to? He said, oh, my name's Alberto Villoldo. So once we'd finished blowing smoke up each other's butts for the next 10 minutes, he said, yeah. He said, Ian, you're more than welcome. He said, he said, I don't know really very much about you other than, what I saw in the Codex presentation. He said, yeah, I like what I saw, and you can come along. He said, but you've got to remember that this is really primarily for people following the Four Winds programs, and they all want to spend time with Aquero, and, you're just really going to have to probably sort of meld into the background and see how it unfolds. I said, yeah, absolutely, understand. So roll the clocks forward to June of 2010. I arrive in Cuzco, and on my first night in Cuzco, I fall down the stairs and break my ankle. It was the altitude sickness. I'd stopped drinking a few years ago, so I didn't, by the way, choose to stop drinking alcohol. I had a bad cold in November of 2008, and when the cold cleared, I just completely lost all desire or taste for alcohol, and I never fought it. So I fell down the stairs, and I realized that I'd broken the ankle, because it was at a rather strange angle under my leg. But I was so tired, and I was so exhausted and so jet-lagged that I couldn't be bothered to get up, so I just called down to reception and got them to bring up a bag of ice and stuck the ice under my ankle. The following morning, of course, I went to the hospital, where the doctor x-rayed me and then put the plaster cast on me. So I thought, this is great, isn't it? This is really fucking great. I've spent all this money, I've come all this way, and the first day here, I've got a broken ankle. That's the left brain talking, of course. And, you can almost sense the right brain going, see how it goes, see how it goes. And anyway, so I get in the cab to go back to the hotel, and the cab driver says, so you need some crutches? And I said, yeah, the doctor gave me an address where I can get some crutches tomorrow morning. He said, no. He said, my sister has some crutches. She doesn't need any more because she broke her leg, so my contribution to the Peruvian economy was to buy this guy's sister's crutches. Probably for about 3 times what I'd have paid for them in a shop, anyway. So now I have my crutches. So the next day we're going up to Pisac, which is going to be our base for the next couple of weeks up in the mountains. And the schedule was that we were going to go out on trips, the buses were going to take us up into the mountains, and then we were going to go for these hikes up to these sacred areas, and the Cuero were going to perform their ceremony. But I wasn't going there, was I? So I just got on a random bus and decided that I was just going to go as far as the bus went, and then I'd just sort of find a nice quiet spot and sit down and chill. And so everybody disappears off into the mountains, and I'm sort of, And I found a nice rock to sit on, and it was beautiful. And it's beautiful, clear blue sky, no chemtrails. Beautiful, clear blue sky, and of course, you sit there for a while, and then the left brain chatter kicks in, doesn't it? So, great, isn't it? Great. You come all this way, you spend all this money, and what do? You're sitting like a bloody gnome on a rock. You might as well bugger off and go home. And the right brain's going, whoa, just relax, just chill, just see how it unfolds. So you're trying to get back into that place of sort of centered stillness and just sort of say, well, it is what it is, and, I might as well enjoy it. So I'd been sitting there for about an hour and a half, and I saw one of these guys start walking down the mountain. And I'm following the path, and I realized that the path comes right down in front of me. So I thought, this is interesting. And sure enough, when the guy gets to me, he comes and stops and just sits in front of me. And, sat and just smiled, okay, and then just sat down. I thought, this is good. Except that I couldn't speak Cuero. If he did speak Spanish, I didn't understand it. Not that my Spanish is that great. He certainly didn't speak English. But we sat there, probably for about, I don't know, 45 minutes or so. And then a second member of the Quero came down the mountain and came and joined him. And now the two of them are chattering away. And I discovered that they did know one word in English: idiot. And they seemed to sort of say it every time they happened to look down at my ankle. But I still couldn't communicate with them, other than like you do, you know, with just sort of, you know. Anyway, a little while later, a third member of the Quero came down. Now, this was the youngest member of the group working with Alberto. Her name was Velma. Very, very interesting lady. She was 38 years of age. She'd been struck by lightning 3 times and had the scars to prove it. And stated that every time she was struck by lightning, then it basically took her to a whole new level of consciousness. Don't try that one at home either. But she spoke perfect English, so now I had my translator. So we started chatting away, and I had these guys' undivided attention for the next 4 hours or so. And then we saw the other people coming down the mountain later on, and so we broke up. And then Velma came running up to me as I'm sort of hobbling along, and she said, "Ian, tomorrow," she said, "we will find you." And I said, "But I don't know which coach I'm going to be on." She said, "We will find you." Well, this went on for like 4 days, and I had these guys' undivided attention. I'd literally take a random coach, find a spot to sit, and then these guys would come find me after an hour, hour and a half or so. Well, on, I think it was the 5th day, I'm going back to my coach, and I got a tap on the shoulder, and it's from Alberto Villoldo. And he said, "Ian," he said, "when we get back to hotel, can I have a word?" Well, I could tell he wasn't best pleased. I said, "Yeah, sure." So I got back to the hotel, and Alberto was sitting in the bar, and I said, "Hey, you wanted a word, Alberto?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "Ian, how much are you paying these guys?" "Paying?" I said, I'm not paying them." He said, "Right, I am." He said, "I'm paying these guys to be up in the mountains conducting their ceremonies." Because what they were doing was, they live a very simplistic life. They work on the basis that Pachamama provides everything that they need. And every time they find themselves in abundance, then they go into ceremony, which is to build these beautiful mandalas and then package them and then burn them. And this, of course, was lost to the world, because these guys were totally lost to the world for 400 years. Because they'd been chased up into the high Andes by the conquistadors. And everybody believed that the conquistadors had murdered them. But they were living up in the high Andes at 16,500 feet. And they came out of the high Andes for the first time in the 1960s, when Alberto was a bag carrier for one of his professors at university. And that was when Alberto decided to change his course to anthropology rather than botany. And he became the anthropologist, and he's dedicated his entire life to working with the Quero. And Alberto said, he said, "Look, you know, Ian," he said, "everybody wants some time with these guys." And I said, "Alberto, look, I'm just going up on a random coach." I said, "I'm not even making a conscious decision about which coach I go on. I'm just going on a random coach, and I'm just going up to a location, and these guys are finding me." And he sort of half smiled. And he said, "Okay." He said, "Well, we'll see what happens." And the following day, these guys came and joined me again, and I told them about the story with Alberto, and they just burst out laughing. And I said, "So what's so funny?" I said, "I just got my butt kicked by Alberto, and you guys think it's funny?" And Velma said, "Yeah, because Alberto knows better than anybody that everybody's where they're supposed to be. And Alberto will just deal with it." So I had an amazing time with these guys, and of course I would never have had this opportunity had I not broken my ankle. It was a clean break. There was no problems with it. And I got back to the UK, went straight to hospital. When I got back to the UK, they put a new cast on it, and within the usual 6 weeks, I was fine. But the ankle break was the catalyst to be able to spend the time with these people. So why did I need to spend the time with these people? Alberto, by the way, everything I'm telling you, I shared with Alberto Villoldo, and he confirms that everything that they told me is exactly what they told him when he first started talking with them in the 1960s. Apart from a bit of the vocabulary change because of the contact they've had, but to all intents and purposes, the stories that they tell are exactly the same. The reason they came out of the mountains in the 1960s was because they had counted off 25 generations. Because they believed that their mission was to stay hidden from the world for 25 generations. And on the birth of the 26th generation, they came down to the lower world to share their insights. Their insight primarily is that the world is about to go through enormous changes. But we have a role to play. And they want to make sure that everybody, as much as possible, understands that we have to participate in this process. Because they said, even though they didn't know any of this, because they've been tucked away for 25 generations, they said the way that humanity is living on the earth today is not sustainable. I think we'd all agree with that. So something has to change, but we have to participate in that process. So they made the observation, they said, first of all, we have to literally participate as though the existing paradigm was going to continue. And the only way in which we can bring about change is literally getting physically involved and doing as much as we possibly can in whatever way we can to help bring about those changes. But they said that of itself is not enough. Because the other thing that we have to do is we have to visualize. We have to visualize. They're very definite here. This is not meditate, it's visualize. It's literally create the quiet space and visualize the type of future that you would like to see. And it doesn't have to be the same vision all the time. You could just be visualizing something for yourself, something for your family, something for your community, for your country, for the world, for the universe, whatever. A different visualization. But they say it's very important that we don't get an existential attachment to a particular visualization. Because if we did so, we might actually limit the outcome. Because we are limited in terms of our perception in this limited realm. So having too much of an attachment may actually limit the ultimate opportunity. And what they make the observation is that if we do both, if we make the time to sit down and visualize the type of change that we'd like to see, not the way in which it's going to come about, just the visualization of the ultimate goal, as far as we can possibly take it, what we will find is that things happen in our physical, empirical, material lives which actually help us to bring about those changes. And they said that this would actually be accelerated. That was June 2010 when I was with them. And they said that this process would absolutely accelerate exponentially with effect from November 2011. And they said, but Ian, it doesn't mean to say you can't start. You can practice. And they said, if you practice, what you will find is that from November 2011, things speed up. And so I said, okay, so what is it that's going to happen in November 2011? And what they said, and Alberto absolutely confirms that this is unadulterated, it's unchanged from what he heard from them 50 years ago. What is going to kick in is this massive solar activity. Now, Alberto says he actually wasn't able to corroborate this until 1972, when he got information from NASA that there was indeed some massive solar activity expected between November 2011 and May of 2013. And then just after I came back from Peru, I read this from an old edition of New Scientist. And it said, solar activity is known to influence human consciousness. Solar flares affect the central nervous system, the stomach lining, all brain activity, including equilibrium, along with human behavior and all psychophysiological, mental, emotional, and physical response. I got to draw a breath for the next bit. Solar flares can cause us to be nervous, anxious, worried, jittery, dizzy, shaky, irritable, lethargic, exhausted, forgetful, have heart palpitations, feel nauseous and queasy, and last but not least, to have prolonged head pressure and headaches. Sound familiar? Well, after I came back from Peru, and after I read this, I vowed that I would not put another pharmaceutical in my body. Because the pharmaceuticals, remember the placebo group? The pharmaceuticals are what shuts down the capability of the body to effectively regenerate, to maximize the opportunities of healing. This is also from New Scientist. This is what's happening right now. In fact, if you look at, there's actually a website that shows the solar activity. If you just Google solar activity, daily solar activity, you'll see the website that says whether or not the strong activity, weaker activity. You can have a look for yourselves here. Well, here's a guy, that's another scientist, whose work was sequestered. This is a guy called Dr. Michael Persinger, and he developed what became known as the Karen helmet, actually after his colleague that developed it. And the Karen helmet has electromagnets around the front temporal lobes. And what Persinger was trying to stimulate was the non-material experience through the stimulation process of electromagnetic fields, small, very weak electromagnetic fields around the front temporal lobes. So this is very similar to sort of the breathwork type thing I was talking about. But he wanted volunteers, and initially he had all these aging hippies coming up from California who thought it'd be a damn sight cheaper than LSD. But he didn't want the hippies, he wanted people who denied the non-material experience. And the most extreme case was a lady by the name of Dr. Susan Blackmore. Now, Dr. Susan Blackmore is a British psychologist who's absolutely locked into the physical empirical material realm. There is nothing that ever happens that can't be explained. Except that when she wore the helmet, to this day, she refuses to discuss her experiences. Now, that speaks volumes. You know, everything I've been talking about today, the vaccines, the pharmaceuticals, kicking off with the drugs like Ritalin, the antidepressants, the SSRIs, the GM contaminated foods, the fluoride in the water, the aspartame in the drinks aimed at children. Everything here is about shutting down the right brain. And this was epitomised. I gave a talk at the Theosophical Society in Cardiff in the UK. Now, it was open to all comers. It wasn't just members of the Theosophical Society. And halfway through this part of the presentation, there was a guy who stood up at the back, and he said, Ian, he said, look, he said, why can't we just focus on the geopolitical? He said, I love all the work you do on the geopolitical, but why do you have to go into all this spiritual shit? And I said, look, you know, with all due respect, I said, there's a number of people here who actually probably can relate to what I'm talking about. So, you know, maybe you just bear with us, and, you know, I'll have a chat with you afterwards. Anyway, when I got to the point where I was saying that all of these things, like, you know, the pharmaceuticals, the vaccines, the food, the water, he stood up and he said, Ian, I've got to apologise. He said, I've been on antidepressants for the last 12 years. And he said, I've been trying to wean myself off them. And he said, and I realised that's what's shutting down my opportunity to experience everything you're talking about here. Now, that in itself, in my opinion, was a major step for the guy. I'm going back to Cardiff early next year, and I hope this guy comes along. I want to see whether he's managed to extricate himself completely. You know, we have a tremendous opportunity to bring about the changes, and even in the quantum realms, my stepdaughter is a quantum physicist, and she absolutely relates to everything I'm talking about, but from a very different angle. This is about a guy called Amit Goswami, and he's a quantum physicist. He's known as the quantum activist, because he shares a similar view from his Buddhist background, that if we visualize, the more we visualize, the more we can help to create the future. You know, one of the things that was fascinating for me about Targ and Puthoff's work was that their remote viewers could not see beyond December 21st, 2012. And when I shared this observation with the Quero, they laughed and said, well, of course not, because it's still being written. And this was 2010. And they said, and we are writing it. Well, the final part, of course, of this attempt to shut everything down shouldn't come as any great surprise. The chemtrails. The sheen that covers the skies. You know, from my youth, where we used to experience these beautiful clear blue days, unadulterated by any clouds. And now I dread those clear days because they're going to be crisscrossed with the chemtrails. Well, I mean, whilst there's a multiple agenda, I think, with the chemtrails, I think a massive part of it is trying to shut down the activation of the right brain by the solar activity. I think these guys know exactly what's occurring and they're running very, very scared. Consider the possibility that I think there are other cultures who knew about the power of the sun there. This is from the 18th dynasty of the Egyptian Akhenaten and Nefertiti. And one of the unique things about their artwork is always the sun's rays. And here you have Akhenaten and Nefertiti with some kind of receptacle looking as though they're holding it up to the sun. Here's a 3D relief, deep underground, which of course the orthodox Egyptologists say they carved by torchlight, hydrocarbon torches, and yet there's no mark in the chamber whatsoever. This beautiful 3D relief here of the sun and the sun's rays. And what's interesting here is the uraeus. The uraeus, which represented the third eye. The opening of the third eye, which was unique to the pharaoh, because it was the pharaoh who had direct connection, of course, with the divine. But what is interesting about this relief is that the uraeus is on the sun, and the sun's rays are coming down here to Nefertiti. And this from Renaissance period alchemy. I have no idea what it represents, but it looks very similar again, you know, to the sun's rays having the impact on the earth. It's my opinion that what they're trying to do is to shut down the process from even starting. Because once we have actually activated it, it's like once the switch goes on, there's no turning it back. Because it's like once one card falls, all the rest start to fall very soon afterwards. This is Einstein. He said, "The intuitive mind is a sacred gift, and the rational mind is a faithful servant. We have created a society that honours the servant and has forgotten the gift. We will not solve the problems of the world from the same level of thinking we were at when we created them. More than anything else, this new century," and he was talking about the 20th century, "this new century demands new thinking. We must change our materially based analyses of the world around us to include broader, more multi-dimensional perspectives." Einstein was a mystic. We're all mystics. It's been shut down. The capability, the capacity has been shut down, deliberately shut down. I don't necessarily understand why, but those who think they're the rightful rulers of this planet do not have access to this capability. And they are running very, very scared that once we access it en masse, then basically their game is over. They know that the solar activity is ramping up. They're trying to demonize it with stupid articles like this in the mainstream media. Huge solar flare will bring end to world in months, and we're ready for it. They're going to shoot the sun, I guess. Unbelievable. NASA have issued their employees with a bulletin, a video bulletin, encouraging all of their employees to prepare for a massive solar event which shuts down all forms of communication. Now, the last time that happened was 1859 when there was the Carrington event, but the only electrical stuff we had around then was the telegraph, and it fried a whole telegraph network. Well, if we had an event like that right now, imagine what it would take out. And when I shared this with the Quero, they laughed. And they said, "Yeah, because you won't need it." And I said, "So will this opportunity be available to everyone?" And they laughed. And they said, "Yes, of course, but not everyone will take it." Because people say, "Oh, I've got to go back and get my iPos, or my computer, or my wallet," because of the attachment to the physical empirical material, when actually, maybe, we've got an opportunity to step way beyond that. Now, listen, the Quero make it very clear that we have to behave as though none of this is based in any kind of reality. We shouldn't have an attachment to this happening. We've got to focus on bringing about the changes that we want to see in the physical empirical material realm. And if we do that and we visualize, then the rest will unfold naturally. Rudolf Steiner made this observation. He said, "He who would create the new must be able to endure the passing of the old in full tranquility." This is why I said this morning, you know, when I was talking about the stuff about having the food and the water and doing the stuff with any assets you got, the gold, it's so that you can free yourself. You don't have to worry about the foraging. You can free yourself to focus on the things that really matter. One of the positions that it's probably a good place to be right now is if you have nothing, you are in great shape. Because you have no attachment to anything. And I know it's a sort of, it's a regurgitation of even more ancient wisdom, but as somebody once said, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for the rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. This is simply a reference to attachment. There's nothing wrong in having accoutrements. It only becomes a problem if there's an attachment to them. So one can argue that if you have nothing, you are relieved of that burden. If you have assets, there's nothing wrong in having them, there's nothing wrong in protecting them, but don't be too attached to them. Whilst we need them, great, but maybe we're coming to a time when we don't need them. I think this is a truly exciting period. It's a massively exciting period. And how did I find Alberto Villoldo initially? Because I was becoming aware that, you know, we were going through an evolutionary process, and I came up with the term Homo luminous. And I thought, that's a good term. Wonder if anybody's ever thought of that. Googled it, Alberto Villoldo, 20 years ago. Homo luminous? It's not the Illuminati. Homo luminous, it's access, it's the capacity to access the full range of our capability and capacity. You know, where the physical empirical material is secondary to everything else that we're experiencing.
There was a movie on TV about a year ago that had that, and it's about a teacher and he evolved into someone who could control other people, and he was hiding from his brothers, and he was hiding behind leaves, and the leaves changed colour, and they couldn't see him, and they can't.
He was camouflaged.
Yeah, do you know that movie?
No.
Does it ring a bell?
No. Oh, was it Celestine Prophecy? Okay, I haven't seen the movie. Now, James Redfield, I mean, James Redfield did an absolutely outstanding job in putting his journey into a fiction, and of course achieved, you know, massive sales. So there's no question, James Redfield has certainly contributed, I think, to raising this type of consciousness evolution into the public arena. Unfortunately, I think when he started getting 10th Insight, it was starting to get a bit commercial. But the initial Celestine Prophecies was an outstanding book. That was the first fiction that I read. So this is really a truly remarkable opportunity, you know. And I've got to say that I wouldn't have missed this for the world. But I'm damned if I want to do it again. So let's get it right. And I'm just going to end with a new play on an old theme. And this was actually a photograph from the Occupy movement in Wall Street last year, but I think that it's very appropriate to everything that I've been talking about today. So thanks very much for sharing the day with me, and enjoy the ride. Thank you. The final session, I just want to acknowledge John Eisen and Catherine for bringing this session together, because there's a number of reasons. I mean, it's amazing the way things work, isn't it, as we're going to talk about. But when I came over to New Zealand last year, I was running a bit behind schedule because the accommodation that had been arranged for me was way up in north of Auckland. And the lady who was arranging the conversation said, oh, by the way, there's a magazine editor that wants to meet you. And, well, if you knew how many times I've heard that sort of observation, and I never got too excited about meeting magazine editors. And we were running way behind schedule, and I said to her, I said, you know what, if we have time to sit with this guy, great. If not, well, you know, so be it. Anyway, we got here, it was in this venue, and we had a little bit of time. So I hooked up with John. He could hardly speak at the time because he was suffering from laryngitis. But we sat down in the cafe just around the corner, and, you know, we got on okay. And then at the end of the evening, he said, oh, by the way, he said, take a few of my magazines. Have a look at my magazines and see what you think. And, of course, in the journey back to the UK, there's a fair amount of time to kill. So I started flicking through these magazines, and I realized this was actually the best product I'd seen. You know, we had Nexus in the UK, but we had nothing of this caliber. So I called John, I think it was about 2 weeks after I got back to the UK, and asked him if, you know, we could actually sort of discuss how we might bring them to Europe. And so that was how I became the publisher of Uncensored magazine in Europe. And then 6 weeks later, I decided that if we got Uncensored, we might as well go the whole hog and go with natural medicine as well. So we've just been going for 1 year. Thank you. But anyway, John said, look, if you come back to New Zealand, and he said, and Uncensored magazine will pay your airfares. So I'm actually here because of the generosity of John Eisen and Uncensored magazine. So thank you. And I know most of you are here because of one or other of the magazines, but they are great magazines. I think they're going to go from strength to strength. And I think in the coming months or years, then I think that Uncensored is really going to take off, because, you know, the mainstream media's circulation is falling because more and more people are realizing that what is published by the mainstream media is just bullshit, basically. It's just propaganda. Conscious. And that's, of course, why we dream. You know, the left brain gets out of the way and we're able to go off into the other realms. But because she was in this permanent state, the left brain was completely out of the way, so she never slept. Now, what is truly remarkable here is the guy who I was talking about earlier, Tony Wright, who wrote the book Left in the Dark, he also, in the mid-90s, in fact 2 years before Jill Bolte-Taylor had her stroke, Tony Wright participated in an experiment with Manchester University in the UK, where under medical supervision he was sleep deprived for 5 days. And the purpose of the sleep deprivation was to shut down the left brain. Now, obviously sleep deprivation can have very serious health effects. That's why Tony was under very strict medical supervision and why he was restricted to 5 days. And Tony, with the benefit of hindsight, actually acknowledges that was probably pretty good, because otherwise he'd have stayed there. But the irony is, the remarkable thing is, that his experiences of life through the right brain, through shutting down the left brain by sleep deprivation, was almost identical to Jill Bolte-Taylor's experience us having the stroke.
Yeah. You know what the best part about being on methamphetamine is? It's only 3 more sleeps till Christmas.
Yeah, that's not to be encouraged. Another way in which you can do this is through breath work. Now this is very hard for about 20 minutes. I think it's a lot easier than sleep deprivation. But if you can find a good breath work practitioner, and one of the best in the business is a lady called Dika Begg. And I had the pleasure of a couple of sessions with Dika Begg, 3 sessions I think with Dika. And after that I decided, you know, I'd been everywhere I needed to go. But it's hard work. It's absolutely, and the last time I did it, I was on the point of giving up because I just couldn't get there. I couldn't get beyond that sort of final hurdle of shutting down the left brain completely. Anyway, just as I was about to give up, bang, over I went. Anyway, when I came back into the body, and Dika is with you the whole way, and she's monitoring the whole process. And when eventually I came back into the body, and she brought me back gently, and she said, so, good ride? I said, oh my God, unbelievable. And she said, I just wanted you to know, you've been away for 12 minutes, and your heart rate slowed to 6 beats a minute.
Wow.
You know, and the alternative publications, and particularly Uncensored, you know, Duncan Rhodes does a very good job with Nexus, but he likes to have his PhDs. You know, Duncan likes to have most of his articles in Nexus written by PhDs because he's almost looking for some kind of sort of pseudo-acceptance of the material that he publishes. And it's great. I mean, Nexus, without any shadow of doubt, has its place and it's very complementary. But what I think Uncensored does is it fills the gap because it covers the spectrum, and I think it's very, very readable. So, thanks, John. Right, and of course, natural medicine. You know, in the UK, it would actually be illegal for me now to publish that magazine as the Journal of Natural Medicine. Because natural medicines, as of May the 1st next year, are illegal. But because it's the New Zealand Journal of Natural Medicine, I can simply say, yeah, but you know, it's what's going on in New Zealand. I'm only publishing it so that people can see what's going on in New Zealand. So we'll see how long we can get away with that one anyway. Okay, so we're heading into this arena now, and of course, you know, over the break, I've had a number of people share with me their remarkable experiences. And of course, they are remarkable because the left brain can't explain them. If the left brain could explain them, you know, we wouldn't consider them to be remarkable. But the left brain can't deny them either. Although, as I'm going to share with you, there are people who will do everything they possibly can to deny that experience. That's called cognitive dissonance. You know, the deliberate attempt by the left brain to effectively shut down an observation which actually can't be denied, but to shut it down because to acknowledge it would force them to change their worldview. So they'd rather deny it. So I said that I would share with you some of the experiences from people who have had a world or life-changing experience which came upon them unexpectedly. And in the cases I'm going to share with you, potentially tragic circumstances, but tragedy that turned into something completely different. The first person I want to introduce you to is this lady here. This lady holding her brain, well, it's not her brain, but holding a brain, is a lady called Jill Bolte-Taylor. Jill Bolte-Taylor is a neuroanatomist. In the mid-1990s, when she was in her mid-30s, she was very, very highly regarded in the study of neuroanatomy. In fact, she was so well regarded that she held positions in academia that were normally reserved for people 20 years her senior. And her specific area of study was recovery from strokes. She was studying the causes of strokes, the effects of strokes, and the recovery of from strokes. Well, in late 96, early 97, she woke up one morning and realized that she didn't feel too good. And she didn't really understand why, because she hadn't had a heavy night the night before. But she realized that, you know, things were a little bit fuzzy and she wasn't thinking quite straight. Well, as the morning wore on, she realized that actually she was in a bit of trouble. And then she collapsed. She was found by her mother, and she was rushed to hospital, where it was established that she'd had a stroke. Focus on you get, well, maybe. When you see, you can Google her giving one of a TED TV 15-minute talk, and it's really quite interesting because it's a classic example of the rose-coloured glasses kicking in as well. Because she's very bubbly, and when she's telling the story, she says, so there I was, this young, very well-regarded neuroanatomist studying strokes. And when I woke up and realised I wasn't feeling very good, it suddenly hit me. I was having a stroke. And I thought, oh, this is exciting. That's the rose-coloured glasses. Well, that's how she sees it, you know, sometime after the event, of course. But the stroke shut down her left brain. And when she effectively came round, when she came back into consciousness, it wasn't a normal consciousness. In fact, her immediate concern was that she was actually in a dreamlike world, and she couldn't even perceive where she started and finished. You know, where her physical vehicle started and finished, because she was just part of everything. And as she was sort of in awe of this new realm, there would be flashes that she would get of people coming in and out of her life, like doctors, like nurses, like her mother. And her mother became her primary carer. And it's actually thanks to her mother, I think, that she made such an amazing recovery in such a relatively short time. But while she was having this experience, she was sufficiently compos mentis to employ the curiosity to be able to try and learn as much about it as she could. She realized she was in a new arena. Now, at the time, initially, she didn't realize whether she was dead or alive, dreaming, in a coma. She had no idea. It was a completely new reality. Some of the things that she started to experience, though, is that she could tell when people were coming to see her. Sometimes she would know a few minutes before they walked through the door, or she would know the day before, or a few days before. But not only that, she could tell whether people were coming to see her out of genuine concern, or just because they were curious. She also discovered that she could predict what was about to happen. And one example, one story that she tells, is that, and this is actually quite synchronistic from a discussion we were having earlier in the day, that she could tell when her mother was going to bring her something, because she would think, oh, I could do with an apple. And then her mother would bring in an apple. And one of the things that she was never actually able to ultimately determine, although she asked herself the question, was she simply being prescient that her mother was about to bring in an apple, or was she creating the event? And she had to leave that one hanging out there. But as these experiences unfolded, she had these flashes of recollection back to her colleagues in neuroanatomy, and she realized that actually this experience would be incredibly useful if she could share it with her colleagues in research. The only problem was she had completely lost control of all her motor skills. So she literally had to fight to re-educate herself so that she redeveloped basically speech, writing, recognition. And with her mother's help, she eventually got there. And she wrote this book, and this is an absolutely stunning book. It's called My Stroke of Insight. Now, this book is an easy read because it's written by somebody who's not trying to explain what happened. She wasn't writing it as a scientist writing an academic paper, trying to justify all of the hypotheses. She was simply recounting her experience of life through the right brain. Bless you. One of the other things, of course, that she learned is that she never slept. She did sleep, of course. In other words, the physical vehicle laid down and rested, but the right brain never slept. She was always